So as you know, the legislation proceeding to CARES 2.0, or you might call revisions to previously passed legislation, is scheduled for the House floor on Friday morning. I've been in constant contact with the Speaker as recently as last night and this morning at just about 9 o'clock. We talked about the final details of the legislation. I would remind all that in the end, this is about $22.5 billion for the state of Massachusetts. Moody's has suggested that there is a 20% drop in state revenues. The state and local assistance is really about, I think, making sure that those first responders, fire and police, sanitation workers, nurses, doctors, and others have the necessary protections as we find ourselves still in the midst of this pandemic. There is an extension of unemployment insurance here that we believe is essential for the American people. There's another $100 billion for our hospitals, which we think is essential for the care that people receive inside of the hospital. There's more money for testing here as well. The retention tax credit is included. And a reminder that on the state and local front, there's almost $1 trillion of aid for local governments. Now, this is and should not be a partisan issue. I did a conference call with the United States Conference of Mayors a week ago, and Republican mayors as well as Democratic mayors were supportive of the contours of the proposal that we formally offered in the last 24 hours. Governors across the country, including Governor Baker, have indicated that they are supportive of what we're attempting to do, as well as Governor Hogan. I call attention to those two because they are Republicans, Democratic mayors. We took a call. Governor Cuomo tried to get me last night, and he couldn't get me, and the staffs exchanged notes. Governor Cuomo was supportive of this legislation as well. And not to miss the point, the Federal Reserve Board, which as you all know, does monetary policy while Congress does fiscal policy, they have, for good and obvious reasons, kept interest rates low. You could borrow money from the federal government's perspective as of yesterday for 0.6% likely over the next decade. A reminder that we are borrowing our own money. This is unlike credit card debt, where you pay a credit card company or you pay a bank. This is money that we borrow from ourselves. So some of the other highlights that are in the legislation as proposed, there is assistance for child care essential workers. There is more assistance for children, families, individuals. We include another round of checks. A family of 5 this time around would qualify for up to $6,000. $1,200, remember, for a single filer under $75,000. $2,400 for joint filers under $150,000. What we do this time around is we boost assistance to those families with dependent children who are in college. That did not occur the last time around. So that's an additional $500 for those children. We also provide assistance for those who are caring for family members who might have a dependent child up to 24 years old. That could be a child who has severe physical or mental challenges. And we believe that this round of assistance will be very helpful to people who, not only in terms of needing day-to-day sustenance, but remember, it also helps to create demand. 34 million Americans have filed unemployment insurance claims, and that means that we had to assist those who are filing those claims. Some states are not doing quite as well on the unemployment insurance front as we are, because we also put $1 billion in last time around for additional technical assistance, as well as there was money there for hiring, and I know in Massachusetts they've brought back retired employees to help sort these unemployment claims. So the last point that I would raise is this: we are better off investing now, trying to stem the tide of the disease, rather than waiting too long when the problem becomes far worse. Now, I understand this is a document of negotiation. But I also would point out that while Senator McConnell has repeatedly said that this is a non-starter in the Senate, he has said that in the previous rounds of negotiation as well. And I think that that's what's important to remember. Despite some of the charged rhetoric that you hear about these proposals, there's another important ingredient to remember here. The Senate has passed the previous 3 rounds unanimously. Democrats in the House voted almost unanimously. There was but one dissenter 3 weeks ago in legislation that I helped to craft and managed on the floor. So the vote in the House 3 weeks ago was 388-5. So I understand posturing, I understand positioning, but also I think that the depth of the challenge we have in front of us has meant that we've had accomplishments in terms of the vote totals in the House. And the Speaker and myself today, we talked about head counting as we did again last night. So we are going to begin counting heads today, proceed to Friday, 9 o'clock, and we will also entertain a rules change on Friday that will deal with remote voting and the idea of proxy voting. So that is still being sorted. And with that, we'll take some questions that you might have. So what happened the last time around was there was an amendment placed in the legislation that said that the money had to be directed to cities of 500,000 and more. I have an idea of where that came from, but I don't want to point the finger. And I think that the challenge that we faced, I've urged the Speaker to use community development block grant guidelines, because that's the most efficient way to get the money into the hands of local officials. That is happening in this legislation. So the state obviously will have some say. So for small communities, the state, and I talked to Senate President Karen Spilka yesterday about that very issue. Money is still likely to make its way to the governor's office for very, very small communities. But overwhelmingly, just about every city and town of the 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts are going to draw a direct benefit here. So I think that the mayors have been correct on this. I think that what we want to do there, because I've been following it from the distance, obviously, but because of that small alumni association of former mayors, I pay attention to it. So I think people who live in Springfield and the surrounding communities who use Springfield's water supply on Cobble Mountain, Blandford, and Ludlow, which is a spectacular story in and of itself, the quality of that water. I think that part of that, the mayor might be able to use some of this money for. If that's the case, that'll be a decision he would make. But this is not to negate the prospect of recovery. So we're in the phase now, I think, of stability and relief. And I think in terms of recovery, these long-term investments that are going to have to be made in infrastructure might be included as well. That if you head south on 91, you can see the work that's already underway as it relates once again to the investment that Springfield residents and ratepayers have made in the city's water supply for more than a century.
So that might be in a future bill. In other words, a future bill.
I think that there's some discretion here for the mayor in what we're proposing with this round, but I think recovery would certainly include highways, roadways, airports, rail, sewer, water, and broadband. Well, I think that speed and balance, those were the terms. And I think that if you recall, the first legislation was written in 8 days. And I can vouch for that Friday night as we worked on that legislation in the Speaker's office, and the two of us negotiated with Secretary Mnuchin for hours. I know that in this day and age of social media and instant opinion and emotion, that somehow that doesn't draw the attention that it once did, the art form of putting together a negotiation. And that meant that the Secretary of the Treasury, which is overseen by the House Ways and Means Committee, that the Secretary of the Treasury would say, let me call you back with our proposals. And then he would propose something and we'd say, we'll call you back. And we would go back and forth with staff, and he did the same thing. And oddly enough, we came to some agreements. I mean, it's hard, as you can tell, to be laconic in moments like this, that's for sure. Yeah.
What would your preferred timeline for the passage of this legislation be?
Saturday morning, yeah. But my preferences might not be the one that are acknowledged here. I do think that Once again, if you read between the lines, Senator McConnell did say that this is a non-starter. Simultaneously, he has said states and cities are going to need more money, and that he's working with the Trump administration. They're likely to outline a similar proposal. I think what's interesting on this is that the president's comments have been more aligned with us as of 2 weeks ago than they are with Senator McConnell, so we'll see whether or not that alignment is ruptured. In my time, I don't know that negotiations ever really break off. I mean, I can tell you the conversations are ongoing, and that doesn't mean that necessarily it's the president and the Speaker of the House. It can mean the two committee chairpersons are continuing the discussions, which I can tell you this, even through all of this, Kevin Brady and I have continued. He's the ranking member on the Republican on the Ways and Means Committee, so we've talked. I talked with the Ways and Means Democrats yesterday. They are supportive of the legislation. We went through it, Zoomed, and had a pretty good conversation. And then the Speaker, and then I did the caucus last night, I should tell you that too. At 5:30 I did the Democratic caucus, and actually they were pretty laudatory in what we've attempted to do here. Well, I'd use a different term than divvying it up. I mean, that's more casino related. I apologize. I think that there are, within community development block grant dollars, there are formulas that have to be adhered to. A lot of it follows a census tract that's related to poverty. In this case, I think that it's likely to return to another era, what we called revenue sharing. So I think that you're going to see a melding of the two. We're going to follow the guidelines of investment, heavy investment, I hope, in poorer communities. And that's, by the way, how the money was tranched in the first round. The IRS, using tax IDs and income guidelines, they got the money to the people who needed it the most right away. It's a pretty astounding statistic that 130 million Americans, 1/3 of the American population, they've received a check. Pretty remarkable. And I hope that now, as the question was raised, using CDBG and giving mayors and local government officials and governors some flexibility on how to expend the money, but also the understanding, as Paul noted, there needs to be a maintenance of effort. We want to make sure that state and local governments are also doing the things that they have to do. I noticed that this morning the governor, yesterday reported late last night, this morning the governor said that he was going to proceed with, I think, a appropriations request of up to $1 billion because he thought that the federal government would come through on that. I've talked to him about that extensively, and I also pointed out that his support was desirable. Yeah, there is. There's about $750 million in there for what we think will be the first round of helping out the motor coach industry. I also think that what's noteworthy about that is that they need more money than that. I have spoken with Secretary Mnuchin. One of the advantages of living in a city is that beginning at about 6 in the morning, I can hear CT Rail from my home. And we're reminded that CT Rail and Amtrak and others, they're running. Airplanes are flying. So I think that motor coach assistance is necessary here as well.
You mean to the private motor coach industry? Bus companies?
It would
Public transit?
both. Yeah, no, you have to do public transit as well. They're really up against it. And I think that I've spoken to the governor specifically about the public transit side of this. Yeah. And people, by the way, just again, anecdotes that are powerful in politics, people are still standing at bus stops. I see it in some obscure locations because the dependability is really important. We do, it's not for the Soldiers' Home specifically, but we do highlight in the legislation some long-term care provisions, and the staff will be happy to get those with you. I mean, the state has been, the Holyoke Soldiers' Home, as you know, it's a bit of a hybrid. The state runs the facility, but there are federal government inspections that take place. And I can tell you that I've spoken to Secretary Azar specifically about the Holyoke Soldiers' Home, so it's on his radar screen. There was another horrific story, as you know, on the front page of the Times yesterday about New Jersey. I think that they have a soldiers' home run by the state again. So it's the hybrid is interesting because it's not a hospital, it's a home, it's a residence. And I saw some of the improvements that were suggested last night and this morning as I was reading about them. I am a regular visitor there. I know many of the people that are there and have an uncle that's there. So, and he was diagnosed with COVID, and he apparently is doing all right. Well, I haven't seen them, so I don't know, but I will tell you that one of the things that has always caught my attention, if you visited the home, first of all, there's no such thing as a single occupancy. That there's 2 twin beds in each room, coupled with the fact if you visited the Alzheimer's or the dementia unit, they literally sit on top of each other. So I think that some of the guidelines I saw, I think the capacity there, the census tract says there's room for 240. I think when the disease broke out, there were 210. So I think that we can use this period to review that proximity. They're really close to each other. You'd be struck by it if you visited the dementia unit or the Alzheimer's unit. And they're, by the way, they're confined. They're locked in. I think that if you look at our responsibilities here, the retention tax credit, the unemployment insurance compensation, the next round of checks, I think the speaker said last night on the caucus call that maybe the staff was listening in. I think she said that about 65% of this was Ways and Means responsibility. Do you remember that number she put out, Liz? Yeah, she said about 2/3 of this is Ways and Means responsibility. So it's been pretty consistent, Larry, going through this process. Yeah, and even for the ones that might not be within my jurisdiction, a profound influence on state and local government. I said that to her specifically as a former mayor. And again, a heavy influence on the Paycheck Protection Program, which I should also highlight that there's $10 billion more here. So that takes it to about $670 billion. There's $10 billion more, and it's more of a set aside, again, for small businesses. The average loan as of last week was $75,000. I've highlighted cases across the congressional district, but for that Paycheck Protection money, those businesses would be out. It's complicated because when you look at what happened at the beginning, there's such a thing as in legislative life, after the intent of the legislation is signed, then there becomes an interpretation of it. So the word choice that the Ways and Means Committee has used repeatedly has been pretty select. But what I think was lacking in the early rounds on PPP, and I talked to Secretary Mnuchin extensively about it, was guidance from the Treasury. So you had these bad stories at the beginning, which seem to have corrected themselves for the most part. And you can see that the initiative has gotten much, much better. Much better. And I've said that to the speaker because I've been out highlighting how the benefit has been passed on. And by the way, it's pretty attractive. If you retain your employees, the loan is forgiven. We're working on that right now with Treasury guidance. Yes, I've raised that question specifically with the Secretary. Yeah. They need some flexibility and they need some room on that for that very reason as you've described it. And there's a tax question there too that needs clarification. We think we clarified it in this legislation, but it will await interpretation from Treasury too once the legislation's passed. Don Beyer from Virginia, who was a member of the Ways and Means Committee, a former ambassador in the Obama administration, we've talked extensively about it. He's the leading advocate in the House for some sort of a trigger mechanism. These are not new, however. When he questioned me about it, I did point out that there was such a thing known as Humphrey Hawkins. And Humphrey Hawkins was counter-cyclical legislation. I didn't serve with Hubert Humphrey, but I did serve with Gus Hawkins. And he was chairman of the Labor Committee when I went to the House. And that would have been consistent, some trigger mechanisms. I think that there's going to be an opportunity here once this hopefully we get to the other side of it, I think there's going to be an opportunity here to examine the role that the safety net plays in American life. Well, I favor it. Let's put it this way, I favor the option. But there's another side to this too, and I've talked to Secretary Galvin about that. I'm all in on the idea of people who want to vote by mail, but it's a bit of a challenge in minority neighborhoods, and he has suggested that. And I thought that the example which I suggested to him was that you might want to consider the special congressional race that took place in Maryland 2 weeks ago with Kawise Mfume, who won the seat. They did use mail-in ballots, but they provided the option for those who wanted to show up in person and vote. They could do that as well. So it'll take some, I think, science for those poll workers who want to participate. But I do think that option ought to be available as well for people who want to vote. I mean, there is another part of this, just to just plant this with you to think of. Voting is also an indication of privacy. That's an important consideration. I think that not only is it a socialization aspect that is largely set us apart from the rest of the world, because we know there's always going to be an election on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. And we already know when 4 years from now and 8 years from now when that's going to occur. So there's this process of socialization that occurs as well, and campaigns build themselves around it. So I think for those who want to vote by mail, I think eliminating the barriers or burdens, I think that's really important, yeah. Well, I mean, I'm two minds on it. I think that you hate to see the precedent of 230 years cast by the wayside, which I don't think it will be, but I think we're talking about an option here. And the other part of it, I think, that we want to be mindful of is that there's one occurrence that we all agree upon, and that is a report from the Senate Select Committee on whether or not Russia interfered in the 2016 election. Republicans and Democrats unanimously said they interfered. Now, I know it's been lost in the news about the pandemic, but the Russians interfered in the election, period. That is not in dispute. So, electronic voting, which you cast your vote in 15 minutes and your name goes on the board, it's part of the permanent record. I think you always want to be sure with remote voting how the technology plays out. And the consideration there should be, is it safe? So you have a clear threat from Iran, North Korea, Russia, and China as to technology. So I think, once again, that it's desirable. I also, when I went to Congress, again, by way of institutional memory, what I think is noteworthy is that we widely used proxy voting, but you had to be in the room. So you could walk in, you could not do it on the floor, that had to be done in person. And even now, the card that you have inside of the house, this card, it not only when you put the card in the electronic box, it tells when you voted, exact timing, and it knows where you voted in the chamber. So proxy voting, and I can tell you that one of the things about proxy voting that I noted, I was kidding Kevin Brady the other day because they're not crazy about proxy voting, and he said, well, why do you like proxy voting? I said, because I want to make sure chairmen have it. It was a good way to keep tabs. So what you would do with proxy voting, for example, one of my criticisms is that a lot of members of Congress, they like to see a lot of subcommittees listed on their stationery. The downside of it is you've got to go to all those meetings. So where I chose to specialize in a handful of areas and would relinquish a subcommittee, once I became a subcommittee chair, I would relinquish my second choice so that somebody else lower down on the dais could get it. The problem was that in '94, one of the first things they did with the contract with America, they eliminated all proxy voting. So it's interesting that here we are 25 years later, and we're looking again at going back to proxy voting. It's going the magnifying glass on this is going to have to be substantial. It's really an important consideration. I think if you talk about the purpose of what you've borrowed it for, what's the purpose? That's the better question. And I think in this instance here, we all should remind ourselves that Majority Leader McConnell authorized the borrowing of $2.3 trillion for a tax cut that overwhelmingly went to people at the very top in America. Remember, the top corporate rate was cut from 36 to 21%. The top individual rate was cut from 39.6 to 37%. And just think of where we'd be right now in terms of a cushion if we didn't have that tax cut of $2.3 trillion. So, and that tax cut, as you know, that each year it accelerates. Yeah. So I think that's the better question is, we're borrowing money to deal with an international pandemic. And I think when you talk about the consequences of borrowing for future generations, borrowing money at nearly 0% interest to deal with a plague is a good investment. Well, they said that on the last 3 occasions. I can't believe there's a Republican in the United States Senate who's not going to vote to give his or her governor some assistance, given the statistical data on, as I outlined earlier from Moody's. These states are up against it. And even the rainy day fund that we should have all been proud of here in Massachusetts, I think that's been exhausted. I think that was generally in the vicinity of $2 to $3 billion a year. And the federal government, for good reason, has the ability to borrow money because we deal with international issues. Depression, war, pandemic. That's the flexibility that's built in. And another reason why I think my votes in leadership against the balanced budget amendment to the Constitution looks pretty good right now. The idea here was liquidity. Liquidity was, from every major economist, left, right, and center, said you need to keep liquidity in the system. So the retention tax credit, the checks that we're sending out, the assistance to hospitals, the money for testing, liquidity. So I do think that that was the whole idea. And remember, when it comes to unemployment insurance, that states administer unemployment insurance. The federal government provides the assistance. We share that responsibility. But it's the state that actually puts the money into the hands of people who need it. And I would say, for the moment, that Massachusetts seems as though it's doing a pretty decent job. That's the safety net, unemployment insurance. Well, I think that the negotiating is a bit different at the moment, because I do think eye contact in negotiating is really important, and I think gestures are really important, and I think the occasional shrug should be acknowledged. I don't know how many times I've gone into the room thinking you can't get a deal, only to get a deal, and other times going into the room thinking you were going to get the deal, only to have it fall apart. But the resurgence to go back into the room again. And so I've had a chance to participate in some really big negotiations over a career. And I think it's an art form, it's a skill set, and it requires listening as well as talking, but it also requires a lot of goodwill that's built on long personal relationships. Yeah. So the four corners in the end will negotiate this. Once the House passes its version, the chairmen have had their moment through Friday, and then once the legislation passes, it'll move to Speaker Pelosi, Leader Schumer, Majority Leader McConnell, and Kevin McCarthy, the Minority Leader in the House. So those are what we call the four corners, yeah. And then the Secretary of the Treasury will sit through those meetings. There'll be social distancing, and they move them around. They'll go from the Speaker's office to the Majority Leader's office, so there's no hometown advantage.